bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the Weird Darkness. I'm Darren Marlar, host of Weird Darkness, where I share stories of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. Recently named one of the best storytellers in podcasting for 2019 by Podcast Business Journal. Whether it's ghosts, cryptids, true crime, or creepypastas, you'll find it all in Weird Darkness. Episodes uploaded 7 days a week. Search for Weird Darkness in your favorite podcast app, or listen now at WeirdDarkness.com.
Hey y'all, you know I'm doing 7 days of uploads in a row. This is upload number 3. I'm having so much fun doing this. I recorded all these this week and I'm coming in every morning doing the edit and putting the podcast together to put them out each morning. So this is a lot of fun for me. I've wanted to do it for a long time. Maybe one day I'll do a 30-day 30-day deal. Hey, before we get started, and I haven't talked about it in forever, is that we have a merch store on Teespring. There's a little banner below this video. You can see some of our t-shirts, but we do really have some cool t-shirts, stickers, posters, coffee cups and different items, masks, if anyone's still wearing masks. Take a look. It's all pretty economically priced. It's not the best price, I'm gonna tell you that, but it's good stuff. And if you buy anything, you're buying my wife and I lunch is what you're doing. After if I make about 10 sales, I get to take her to dinner, and it's a great deal for me, and you get something for your money. The next thing I want to tell you is don't forget our sponsor, YetiBars.net. Yeti Bars has some great soap and moisturizers with all kind of woodsy and girly scents that I think you all will really like. The reviews on this soap are spectacular, as well as the customer service. These guys, it's two brothers running a soap company out of New Mexico, and they do a great job. They're hustling, they're working hard, and they're doing everything right. They give a lot back to the community. Remember Yeti Bars when you need some soap. And at checkout, use the code DC10 for a 10% discount. You get 10% off your purchase. YetiBars.net and Yeti Bars on Facebook. Go take a look. All right, let's get into this podcast. Okay, here we go. Short little story from Lisa. When I was 15 years old, I was visiting my best friend in St. Paul, Minnesota. We'd been best friends since second grade, even though we lived in the same state for only 2 years. Because I had recently lost my brother in a car accident, we spent a great deal of our time ruminating endlessly about life after death and the paranormal nature of our world. Whenever I flew to Minnesota for a visit, we would hang out with a bunch of adorable 16-year-old boys who could drive. Our favorite destination was a couple of miles away. It was a beautiful lake surrounded by dense woods. We were a very clean-cut bunch, so there was no drinking at all, just breathless crushes on the private school preppy boys and lots of flirting and laughter. One summer evening, we all drove to this glorious lake in the moonlight and walked through the old-growth trees. As my friend and I stopped under one very large, gnarled, ancient tree, something inexplicable happened. It was like a glass bell jar fell over us, and we could not hear a thing. There were no crickets, no wind, and no waves lapping at the lake shore. Even the boys who were joking around no more than 10 feet away from us were muffled and distant sounding. I asked my friend, "Do you feel this? What's happening?" She was stunned and frightened. Clearly, only the two of us were experiencing this dead, eerie, unnatural silence. It was like we had just for a couple of minutes stumbled into an alternate dimension. Just as suddenly as it fell over us, the bell jar lifted and all the noises resumed. We're now in our mid-60s with grown children of our own. We're still best friends and we still talk about that experience. For years and years, we attributed it to my brother trying to send a message from the afterlife. In recent years, I've heard of many Bigfoot accounts and on your site that make me think now that this was a close encounter with a creature instead. It makes sense, perhaps, that they can flip into a different dimension and alter ours. Whatever the case may be, we certainly did experience something otherworldly that evening, even if just for an unforgettable moment. Thank you for reading my story. Whoa, Lisa, that's an awesome story. I think that's as interesting as any other encounter that we may hear on this podcast. It's astounding, and what's even more astounding is, it could have been anything. You don't know. Is that you connected it with Bigfoot so many years later after it happening. That's real interesting to me, and I wonder if any, honestly, I've never heard an encounter like this. The way she described it, it's like a jar was put over them and they were cut off from all the sound and vibrations from everything around them for a few minutes, and then the jar's lifted. That's fascinating to me. I'd love to know if anybody else has had any kind of experience like this, because this is something that would be worth really digging into. But Lisa, thank you for sending this story. It was great. It was short, to the point. It was perfect. Thank you, ma'am. This email's written by, he doesn't want his name revealed. So I won't say his name. No big deal. Here's his email. This is great. This story took place in 1978 when I was 14 years old. I grew up in the deep woods of the Catskill Mountains, about 30 miles north of Hunter Mountain Ski Resort. My grandfather's 500-acre farm bordered many square miles of the state forest. It was a dense wilderness crisscrossed with dirt roads and logging roads and dotted with a few old abandoned farms. It was a remote and desolate area. I've spent my whole life hunting, trapping, and fishing those woods. This encounter happened in late October on a clear moonlit night. I was raccoon hunting with my uncle. He had some very well-trained raccoon dogs that always managed to tree at least 3 or 4 coons every time we went out. It was quite cold out that night, and 2 hours in, they were uncharacteristically unsuccessful. Finally, they started barking, hot on a trail. We were maybe a mile from my grandfather's farm when we started in the direction of their barking. The dogs were across the gully up on the next ridge, and my uncle and I were walking up an old dirt road that would eventually take us up to an old abandoned farmhouse. From there, it would be a straight walk down across the gully and up to the ridge where the dogs had by now treed the raccoon. It was 2 a.m., and we were about 200 yards from the farmhouse when I noticed loud footsteps 100 yards off to my right in the woods. I didn't think much of it at first because I figured it was a big deer or a bear. But as we continued up the road, I noticed it getting closer. What's more, I could tell it was walking on 2 feet. My first thought was that it was another hunter, but that made no sense. Only raccoon hunters hunt at night, and there were no other dogs in those woods. Then I noticed how heavy the steps sounded, crunching branches and being quite obvious. I asked my uncle if he was hearing what I was hearing, but he said no. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam, so his hearing was bad from all the concussion blasts during combat. He had a hard time hearing low-frequency noises like footsteps in the leaves. He was a real badass with many confirmed kills and multiple gun wounds and hand-to-hand combat knife wounds, so he wasn't afraid of much. He'd also grown up in these mountains, as did 3 generations of our family. He told me it was my imagination getting away from me, so I just said, well, okay, and I kept walking. I was starting to get nervous, though. All we had were our .22 rifles and a .22 caliber pistol. Whatever was coming towards us sounded big, and there weren't going to be much protection against whatever this thing was. It started walking parallel to us while edging closer to the road until it was obviously really close, and my uncle finally put his hand on my chest and whispered for me to stop. We stopped, and it continued about 2 more steps, and then it stopped too. Now my uncle knew there was definitely something out there, maybe 30 feet to our right. We started walking again, and so did it. Again, my uncle put his arm up to stop us, and just like before, it took a couple of more steps and it stopped as well. I could feel the apprehension from my uncle. The full moon was bright enough to light the road, but we could not see into the dense forest. My uncle shined his flashlight into the woods, but they were just so thick he couldn't see anything. "Let's keep moving," he said. It continued to follow us. Now I could tell my uncle was getting real nervous. This thing was bipedal and it was large. By the time we reached the farmhouse, it was only a few yards away. We quickly got up on the broken down porch and turned to face our stalker. The beast kept coming. Just when it was about to break into the clearing in front of the house, it stopped. We stood there not knowing what was going to happen next. He shined the flashlight into the woods and could vaguely see a large figure just inside the tree line. It was impossible to make out any detail other than it was very dark in color and at least 3 feet taller than my uncle, who was about 6'2". This thing was massive. It filled the air with a musky stench, and for the first time in my life, I could tell that my uncle was actually afraid. Suddenly it started to walk to the right down through the woods away from the house. We could hear it leaving as it stomped down the hill until we could not hear it anymore. We waited 10 minutes listening for any more movement. It was silent, so we started down the gully up to the ridge where the dogs were still barking. We got there without further incident, shot the coon, bagged it, and decided to call it a night. Although we didn't see or hear anything again, we noticed the woods were unnaturally quiet, like they were devoid of wildlife. The dogs were acting strange, too. They kept sniffing the air and whining all the way back to the truck. We'd never seen them act like this before. My uncle sold all his coon dogs shortly after that and didn't hunt at night anymore. When people asked him why he quit coon hunting, he'd tell them he wasn't making enough money on the pelts to make it worth his while. I knew that wasn't true. Back then, pelts on a big coon sold for $45, more than enough to make pursuing that hobby worthwhile. If I asked my uncle what he thought it was that night, he won't talk about it, not even to me. He rarely hunts during the daytime anymore, neither do I for that matter. I had seen very large bare footprints in the snow when I was trapping for muskrat a few years earlier, so I'm pretty sure I know what was stalking us on that cold October night. If it wasn't Bigfoot, what could it have been? I've had other encounters. I've smelled him and sensed his presence, but never really actually seen one clearly. But those are stories for another time. My account of this event is exactly as it happened. I would swear on my children they are a fact. I appreciate having an outlet to share my experience and knowing there are others who have had similar encounters. I don't feel alone on this subject anymore. Bigfoot is alive and well. Well, to the writer, I would quit coon hunting too. I've only been on a couple of raccoon hunts, and to me, they weren't very fun. I mean, it's a lot of work. It really is a lot of work. I know some guys who hunt them off of mules and horses, and maybe that's a little easier, but you know, some of these hunts go through some nasty terrain, and these raccoons are they'll go through just about anything to get away from those dogs and finally get up in a tree. And if the dogs can tree them, that's one thing, but getting to the tree is another. And so you have to go through some of the worst briars and brambles and brush, and you know, a lot of guys come out of there cut up. But some guys make it look easy. I don't know. I really admire them. And the guys who do hunt them are just unbelievable. I mean, they love it. They're hooked on it. I can't imagine being out in the woods and knowing something that big was tracking me 30 feet away and taking steps every time. I mean, that would just be unnerving. This was a great story. I love these raccoon hunting stories. And thank you to the writer for sending it. It was really good. Appreciate you.